go ahead and grab one of those if you need one. I mentioned the missions conference, and there are a couple of special events there that if you have not yet signed up to be a part of, please do post haste tonight, tomorrow morning at the latest if you could. There's a golf outing for the men on Friday, and then ladies brunch on Thursday. Times and everything you'll find in Connecting with Faith. You can use that as a connector to sign up. But if you haven't already, please do. If you haven't signed up for the golf yet, can I talk to you tonight? See Larry tonight as he puts all that together. Larry contacted me yesterday and said, because all the missionaries that are coming are playing. And I always tell them, and if you're not a golfer, you can come out and have a great time anyway. I always tell the missionaries that in the format we use, you can play even if you don't know which end of the club to hold. So Larry got a hold of me yesterday and he said, how many of them need clubs and are any of them left-handed? And then he said, and also check on their handicaps. So, and he explained why, and it makes sense. I always tell him my handicap is my whole game. It's just the whole thing is a handicap. But so I got a hold of the missionaries and I asked them, and Brother Counterman that is coming, kind of gave the picture of it when he sent me an email back, and he said, brother, what is a handicap? And I sent that on to Larry, and I said, it's going to be a fun day. And it will be. If you can plan on playing with us. And if you can play a little bit, our keynote speaker, Brother Hamilton, having some shoulder problems, said he probably can't swing a club very well, but he can putt, and he can enjoy the fellowship. And so plan on joining us if you can. It's really a wonderful time together, a good time of fellowship. Looking at our lesson as we continue this, I was thinking, sitting here this evening, that we'll probably finish this up about the time that we meet Esther and Mordecai in heaven, okay? Because we just keep plodding through it. Now, next week we won't be having a time together because missions conference is starting, although I was thinking about asking Brother Hamilton if he wouldn't mind if I squeezed this in before he spoke, but that would make for too much of a late evening. So we plod along through it. You know the account, but again, the fascinating thing as we look through this is to see God's hand in it all, unbeknownst really to all those who are a part of it. Not only to the ungodly, who God is intervening with to accomplish His purposes, but we also see here, as we've studied through this, I don't know that Mordecai, that Esther, that the rest of the Jews really understood what God was doing. And yet we can see it from this perspective and see it clearly, and that ought to be an encouragement to us and really ought to strengthen our faith in what God can accomplish as we go through this study. So, we're looking tonight at Esther chapter 6, and chapter 5, and verse 1 down through verse 14. I'll not read all of these to start. We'll look at them as we go. But we start out in verse 1. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Father, thank you for the time that we have to consider your majesty and your glory. Thank you that we can look in a very clear example and testimony of that, how you worked and how you used all this to your glory and the majesty of a God who can intervene and accomplish whatever needs accomplished. We read this again, Father, from afar. We read it in your word and we know what's happening and we know how it turns out. Thank God for those who were here, Lord, and didn't know how it was going to turn out and trusted you anyway. May that be a challenge to our own hearts when we don't know the end, but we trust you. And I pray, Father, that that would be an encouraging thing that we see here in your word. Bless the Kids for Truth tonight, those in the nursery, the teens meeting downstairs, those in the Spanish ministry tonight. Blessing each, and again, blessing our time here. In Jesus' name, amen. Look at your intro if you would, and you've got it on your paper or up here behind. But you'll recall that what we looked at in chapter 4, when Mordecai had challenged Esther, and Esther basically said to him, I can't go into the king, because if I go in and I've not been called, he can have me killed. That's the law of the land, unless he reaches out a scepter to me. And he hasn't called me in 30 days. And so I can't just sashay in and say, I need to talk to you. That's not the way that it worked. And you'll recall that Mordecai said to her that God had brought her into the kingdom for such a time as this. And he said to her, don't think that if you are spared because you don't go in under the king and somehow you're spared, don't think that that's going to happen, and don't think that your family is going to be spared, because that's not going to occur. They're all going to be killed. He did say to her that they knew, and I think we need to understand this as well, that God would send deliverance from another angle, from another source, but that certain death was going to come, at least to Mordecai, certainly to Mordecai. And if his relationship to Esther was uncovered, she would die too. And the king was a fool. He was easily duped. And so anything that Haman wanted to do through the king let him do. So Esther had sent, you'll recall, she had sent word back to Mordecai and said, I'm going to fast for 3 days. I want you all to do the same. And then we will do as God instructs. She realizes that the outcome of her actions could be death. You'll recall that she said, if I perish, I perish. And that's an attitude really that we all ought to carry when it comes to our testimony for God, because so often we are hesitant in our testimony for God, and our life isn't even on the line. We think, well, I can't be a bold testimony for Christ because people will think I'm weird, or the neighbors won't like me, or the guys at the job will tease me, or in a different context, the kids at school will think I'm odd. I'll give you an example that this was not dealing with the politics of anything, but how many of you watched President Trump's speech last night? Okay, I will say this, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was amazing how disrespectful and dishonoring, not just to him, but to the presidency and to all those different people that were recognized, and the Democrats couldn't stand up. I heard this today. I didn't notice it last night, but when that little boy was being recognized, and by the way, if that didn't break your heart, you need to have a checkup. But when that little boy was recognized who had survived brain cancer, and then the president had him presented with a badge and made him a part of the Secret Service and all the things that were involved in that, the Democrats who just sat there. And I had heard that, what's her name, Deborah Wasserman Schultz, just sat, and I saw a picture of her sitting with a smirk on her face. But I noticed today when I saw a little clip of that, the woman sitting beside, I would not say lady, but the woman sitting beside Wasserman Schultz was shaking her head, and you can almost read her lips saying, this is ridiculous. And that was their attitude. But I understand, I heard this today, that somebody was watching, and there was a row of the liberals who would not stand up, and one of them looked down the aisle and said, we should stand up for this. And the rest of them said no. So he didn't. And that struck me because of his lack of character and courage. But it also convicted me because how many times have we not stood up for our Lord because nobody else will? And what we see here with Esther is she says, if I perish, I perish. We ought to consider that when we think, I don't want to be too bold of a witness because somebody won't like me. You know, we all understand this. Somebody doesn't like you anyway, okay? That's part of life. Everyone doesn't like you. And so somebody doesn't like you anyway. It might be because of the way you comb your hair, might be because of what you like to eat for dinner, any numbers of reasons. But when we allow our testimony for God and our witness for our Lord Jesus Christ to be hindered by that, something is drastically wrong. Drastically wrong. And so even though we look here in Esther, and God's name is never mentioned, but Esther had a conviction that she had to do something, and even if she died doing it, she would. Again, you look back at the intro, she's willing now to do what must be done and leave the outcome in the Lord's hand. And really, that's how we ought to live our lives every day. We do what God would have us to do and leave the outcome in His hands. What a lesson we should learn from this matter, and we should, and not only a lesson from it, but encouragement from it. Because, again, unbeknownst how God was going to work, they pressed on and did what they knew to be right in this case. Mordecai and now Esther following suit. And it ought to encourage us to do right, to trust God no matter what circumstances around us look like. How often we fret about what might happen rather than in simple faith trusting God. You know, we can live our lives paralyzed because we always say, well, what if? Or what about? Or what's going to happen? And we don't know, but our good God does, and that's where we need to trust Him. Okay? And so we see that as the beginning of the intro. If you look at the second part of that, in this chapter, we see the situation really begins to turn. Haman has had his ire stirred against Mordecai and against all the Jews. He's already talked to Ahasuerus and gotten approval to issue an edict that all the Jews, within a year, all the Jews were going to be killed. He hated Mordecai with a passion and longed to kill him most of all. But things are still to some degree as they had been. Mordecai is still in the gate. The Jews are still living. But Haman is becoming more and more puffed up. The stage is being set for his downfall and for the preservation of the Jews. And again, as an encouragement, in every one of our lives, right here tonight, what transpired today, God is setting the stage for what He's going to do with us beyond this point. And what a wonderful thought that is. Sometimes we get frustrated. God's kind of changed me a little bit in that, but I will admit that frustration still comes. One of the things that bothers me a lot, some of the red lights, when they turn green, they're short. And somebody in front of you is texting. And the light turns green, and they're texting. Or another one, and this is just the way I was taught to drive. When the car in front of you moves, you move. You don't sit here and say, they're moving, now I'll move. And so the car in front of me, the car in front of that person is moving, and you can almost see the wheels turning. Okay, that was a bad pun, but you can almost see the brain work going, and they're saying, okay, they're moving now it's time for me to take my foot off the brake and put it on the gas pedal. Then you got a 15, 20-foot gap between them, and by the time you get up there, the light's already turned red again. Do you realize that every time that happens, God is not surprised by it? And somebody might facetiously or maybe with a sense of mockery say, are you telling me that God's using that? Yes, He will. He will. Every instance in our life is to bring God glory and God's perfect design for us. Again, God's providential hand is very evident in the details and timing. And we'll touch on that briefly tonight, but we'll see it as we go along as well in the next week or so. Had Esther not, and this is the point, had Esther not planned a second banquet at which she was to make her plea to the king, the events of chapter 6, which are so vital to the king's disposition, attitude in the whole thing, they never would have occurred. Now, some people would look, and some Christians would look, and they would say, boy, lucky that she did that. No, it's not luck. It's God's direction. And what you and I need in our lives is a sensitivity to God's direction so that we follow it. And we see that transpiring here. We come to verse 1 and verse 2, which we've just read, and Esther presents herself to the king. Again, reflecting back in chapter 4, in verse 16, where she says, so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. Esther presents herself to the king, as we mentioned a moment ago, knowing full well that she could die for walking into the throne room. There are some things I would hope in our lives, particularly the testimony of our God, that we ought to be willing to die for. That we ought to be willing to say, if this costs me my life, God's still in control. One of my favorite passages is where Job says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. If that's God's design. I almost died one time in a collapse of bleachers. I had bleachers collapse and fold up with me in them. And I had my right arm was up here, and angle iron came down against it, pressed against my chest. I couldn't breathe. And a couple of guys were fairly quick thinkers and grabbed it to keep it from collapsing anymore. And one guy was very quick on his feet and got come along and hooked it up and pulled it up just enough, unbolted that angle iron, which I got my arm out, but now that angle iron is sitting on my chest, and I'm barely getting any air in. And he got that and bent it up this way, and another guy said, put your arm around my shoulder, and I did, and they just pulled me out of that thing. You could almost hear it going when I was coming out. I felt that way anyway. When somebody talks about a chicken laying an egg, I've got a concept of what that egg feels. But I remember lying there on the foot part of the bleachers, unable to breathe. For whatever reason, I had a wrench in my hand, and I never let go of that wrench. But I remember lying there and saying, Lord, if you're ready to take me home, that's good. The kids were small then, and I said, just take care of Debbie and the babies. And there was a peace about it. It wasn't because I was so strong or anything of that nature. It's what God gives us at those times in life if we're trusting Him. I told that story one time, and somebody said, so did you survive? That's not yet been determined. Okay? But Esther here is presenting herself to the king, knowing full well this might be the last thing she ever does. But she's willing to do what's needed to be done. She's willing to do what's right. So she presents herself to the king. Esther put on her royal apparel and waited for the king to recognize her. Now, this is a whole different concept of what we have of a man and wife. And Esther had become Ahasuerus' wife after Vashti was banished, and they had that whole parade of maidens that came, and she was picked, and now she's the queen. But it's a whole different dynamic. And so she knows that she can't just, again, as I said a little while ago, she can't just fly in and say, hey, Ahasuerus, we need to talk. So what she does, if you look at verse 1, it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And so what we have here is we have her kind of lurking until he sees her. It's not incidental that she put on her royal apparel. She had respect for the law, and she was going in to see the king. It'd be kind of like a foreign leader going to meet with the president in the White House and wearing pants and a shirt instead of a coat and tie. I mean, just speculatively, not that something like that would happen, but speculatively. It's kind of like that. And she said, I've always admired that about Joseph. When Joseph was called up to meet with Pharaoh out of the prison, and what did he do? He cleaned himself up, he shaved his face, he put on clean clothing before he went into the king. A part of that we need to recognize, and it's not just in apparel, we understand that, but we are representatives of the King of Kings. And Esther puts on her royal apparel and waits for the king to recognize her. And I don't mean recognize her by saying, hey, aren't you Esther? But for him to look and recognize that she's standing there waiting to see him. Verse 2, if you look at it, it says, and it was so, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. That was the procedure. That's how it worked. Now, we put here on the lesson, and you can see it above me or on your own lesson. The king puts forth the golden scepter, indicating that she's accepted, and that shows that God is clearly in control. Even in the actions of a wicked king. We cite here Proverbs 21:1. Somebody want to read that for us? Go ahead, Michael.
The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever he will.
Okay. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. Now, when we look at the modern political climate in which we live, we don't live under a king, but the leadership that God gives us, they're in his hand. They don't know that. And I know I've heard Mr. Trump say repeatedly, I heard him say it last night, that when he was in Butler, PA, and a bullet went through his ear, and he said he believes that God saved his life. And okay, I'm not going to argue with that. But it's more than that. It's the fact that you and I trust God, not in earthly rulers. We trust God, not in earthly governments. And this is what's transpiring here, unbeknownst to Ahasuerus, and really I kind of think unbeknownst to Esther. But God is in control. Verse 3 and 4, the next thing that we see here, there's a simple request. Look at it if you would. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? In other words, what do you want? What wilt thou? And what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. Now we'll stop there for a second. What you find is the king says, what can I do? What can I give you that will make you happy? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. Now what that tells us about Ahasuerus, and really tells us about human nature, is the temporal is what always seems important. And he says to her, I'll give you half the kingdom. Well, half the kingdom is not just this property, but it's half of everything in the kingdom. Half his riches, half of all that he owns, and it can become hers just by saying, I'll take that. And that's what he expected. Isn't that what the world expects? Sadly, isn't that sometimes what Christians look for? We look and we say, well, if I did this, I'd get that. If I did this, this is the benefit to me. And so we often make unwise choices because we're looking at the temporal gain that come with those unwise choices. Somebody has asked me from time to time, is it wrong to change jobs if another job will pay you more? And my answer has always been, no, it's not wrong, but there's a lot more in the equation. So you may make more money and you can never be in church. Well, it's a bad decision. You can make more money and it's going to put a strain on your family. Well, that's a bad decision. And you've known this to be true, and I have as well over the years, where people find, they're doing well, they're growing in church, they're serving God, and a lucrative job offer comes along. It might be an advancement where they are, might be a totally different company that has come after them with a headhunter and said, we'll pay you this, and it's an exorbitant amount of money. And so they move. And as times have been, and you maybe have experienced this too, people will say, Pastor, pray that we can find a church when we get there. And I've often told them, I said, you're a little late. You need to pray about that before you take the job. And we've seen it happen where 2 or 3 or 4 years later, they're traveling and you stop in and you ask them, have you found a church? No, we haven't found one yet. Keep praying. Did God lead them there to not have any outlet of service, not to be a part of a local church? I don't think so. What they did was they chased the money. Now, they weren't doing anything illicit. It wasn't like they became drug peddlers or anything of that nature, but they were chasing the temporal gain. And that's exactly what Ahasuerus assumes here that Esther is after. But look, if you would, verse 4, and Esther answered, if it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I prepared for him. So you look at your outline up here. The king offers Esther up to half his kingdom. She instead simply requests that he and Haman attend a banquet. It's just going to be the 3 of them. But this is what she requests. Now I can imagine that Ahasuerus is bemused by this. One commentator that I was reading said it's likely that Ahasuerus thought this was some kind of little game that she was playing. And so he played along. Okay, I'll come to your little banquet. It's kind of like daddy sitting with a 3-year-old and drinking tea out of a plastic cup that has nothing in it and commenting how good it is. Why do we do that? We do that because we think, well, I'll play along. Okay? And it's a sweet thing to do and it's fun. So we'll just play along with that. Or they'll say, here, Daddy, try this. And they'll take an empty plate and an empty plastic fork and say, it's cake. Try it. And so you take, oh, boy, that's good. Okay? And some have suggested that's kind of a Ahasuerus response here, is he's going to play along. Now, what he's anticipating as he plays along, we don't know. And the commentators that have suggested that didn't have any answers to that. But she simply requested what she was there for. And it was not to get rich. It was not to get gain. It was to allow God to work. And so this is the thought that she has. She has gone in. She's not going to be killed for going in. And she makes a very simple request. We come to verses 5 down through verse 8. Look at verse 5, if you would. Then the king said, cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. This feeds the arrogance of Haman. There's a reason for that. Because the more arrogant he becomes and the more important in his own mind he becomes, the more closely he comes to the fall, to the destruction that's going to come. And he's eating this up with a spoon. Now you look here, and it may seem odd that Esther would string this out. She knows what's transpiring. She knows from Mordecai that Haman is going to have all the Jews killed. She knows that if all the Jews are killed, that includes her. So what does she do initially? She said, let's have a 3-person banquet. And we can look at that on the surface and say, wow, that seems kind of odd. Why didn't she go in unto the king, and when the king says, what will thou have? I'll give you half my kingdom. She says, no, what I want you to do is put the brakes on the wicked plan of Haman. Haman wants to kill all the Jews. As we mentioned a little bit ago, I think as we read through this, and you've read through it many times probably over the years, Ahasuerus doesn't come across as the brightest light in the harbor. He has been duped already by Haman, and he's issued a decree. He's probably thinking, I can't go back on that now. So God is directing in all of this. And not only that, but it also allows in that time frame for her to, as I said here, string it out. And it may not be the best choice of words, but it allows the construction of the gallows that are found in verses 9 through 14. Haman went out of there, joyful and with a glad heart, verse 9. And when he saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation toward Mordecai. That just continued. Haman decides that he's going to build a gallows. We'll talk more about those gallows in a moment. But this sets the stage for this. Realize tonight that when we look at something in our lives that seems extremely urgent to us, that we need this fixed now. We need this to happen now. God knows beyond the now. And there are times when God doesn't act now like we think he should, like we hope he will, because he knows the picture better than we do. That's the essence, isn't it, of faith and trust? That's the essence of when we look at things in our lives that are problematic and we go to God and we say, Lord, I'm giving this to you, take control. Instead of saying, Lord, I'm giving this to you, take control, and here's what I want done and here's when I want it done. It's like the guy that said, Lord, give me patience and give it to me now. Yeah. You want it immediately. Well, that's not how God works. And do we really believe that God's plan is always perfect? Because again, that's the core of our trust and faith in him. What does his word say? Do we really believe it? What does God do? Do we really trust him? And so we see here the feeding of the arrogance and how God is working out the details on that. You look at, again, 5 through 8, and all of this is transpiring here. Esther said, my petition and my request is, verse 8, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petitions and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king has said. This is that second banquet. And as his arrogance is fed and he is riled even further against Mordecai, he begins the process of building, and we'll talk about it in a minute, building the gallows. Again, as we talked about, had that second banquet not been held, and we'll look at, not tonight, but we'll look at things that transpired in the course of that second banquet and how that turned Ahasuerus' heart away from following after Haman's instruction. And all the details of all of that took place and God's perfect timing in it includes that very fact here, just come tomorrow to another banquet, which again seems so docile to us on the surface. Hey, come over for lunch tomorrow too. Do we ever think in terms of contact that we have with people and how God is maybe preparing their hearts? Maybe God's preparing our hearts. Maybe God's preparing both of our hearts so that when that next time comes. And the danger is sometimes we look at talking to somebody about Christ and we think, well, it just doesn't seem like the right time, and I'll wait till the right time comes. I had a cousin that came through here a few years ago that I hadn't seen in 57 years. The only way I recognized him was he looked like my grandmother. I didn't tell him that. I wanted to keep on good terms with him. But I remember praying, Lord, I've not seen him in 57 years. How foolish it would have been for me to say, well, let's just be nice, and then when God gives another opportunity. When? 57 years later? And I haven't seen him since. And so I was showing him and his wife around the property. Debbie had run an errand. She was coming back when we were going to lunch. And I said, come on, I'll give you the nickel tour real quick. And we stepped in here, and his wife, Dina, looked around, and she said, this looks like our church. Bam! Here's an entrance. And so I said, where do you guys go to church? And Dina and Bruce both spoke up kind of simultaneously, and they told me the name of the independent fundamental Baptist church that they attended in Oregon, where they lived at the time. And so I said, have you both trusted Christ? Are you both saved? Why would I not ask that? Why would I walk away and just kind of hope that they were? And hope I have another shot in another 57 years? Now, according to what we see in the government right now, another 57 years, I might still be collecting Social Security, but I'm not going to be around to talk to them. Okay? And so I asked them that. I said, have you both been saved? Have you trusted Christ? And they said, we sure have. And I remember Dina saying to me, and I'd never met her before, and he'd picked her up somewhere in those 57 years, but she said, so you don't have to worry about talking to us about salvation because that's settled. I rejoiced in that. Man, I rejoiced in that. But sometimes we allow Satan to talk us out of the opportunity that's staring us in the face. God's timing is perfect. There are times when you talk to somebody and you may say to them, hey, listen, let's meet back here tomorrow and have coffee and talk some more. You digest what we've talked about and allow God to work in that. But that's following his leadership. And again, sometimes unbeknownst to the people involved, that's exactly what Esther is doing here. And it allows that construction to take place. Verse 9 through 14, Haman's boasting and callousness. This is one of my favorite accounts in Scripture. And when I read through this, I am always, I don't know what the word I want to use, but kind of overwhelmed with how wicked people can be. And it's evident in this. You look in verse 9, then when Haman went forth, then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. Why? Because I'm special. I just had lunch with the king and queen. Nobody else did, just me. And not only that, but I've been asked to come back tomorrow. And it's not potluck. I don't have to bring anything. I just have to come, and they want me with them. And he has that attitude and opinion of himself. But then he saw Mordecai again. And what he ends up doing here is he begins to plot and plan. He wants to kill, if you look at verse 9, Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him. He was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. What did he refrain himself from doing? Well, if you look at your outline, he refrained himself from killing him on the spot. He was so angry, he could have reached out and with his bare hands grabbed Mordecai around the throat and choked him to death. But here's where the arrogance and the callousness comes in. He wants to make it very grand. How many of you watched the old Batman television show years ago? Okay, Batman, you remember that? It was on 2 nights in a row. Tune in tomorrow night, same bat time, same bat channel. And you would have the Joker or the Riddler or the Penguin or whoever else it was. And they're going to kill Batman and Robin. And they've got them restrained. And they can't move, and they're fighting to get loose, and they can't get loose. And they plan this thing where they're going to tie him to a table, and this big saw blade is going to come down over a period of time and cut him in half. And I remember as a kid thinking, why don't you just shoot him? I mean, you want him dead, you got him held, just shoot him. And I realized that would have made for bad television. Okay. Batman was the hero. But they always wanted to make it a grandiose presentation of how they were going to kill the guy. Well, that's what you got here with Haman. He's not content to just go ahead and kill Mordecai because he hates him. He wants everybody to know what he's done. He wants it all portrayed. Verse 10 tells us that he refrained himself. After all, as you see here, Haman in his own mind was on top of the world. Hey, I'm in tight with the king and queen. I've got this authority. Who knows where it's going to end? I can just keep rising up. I'm going to be wealthy. I'm going to be famous. I'm going to have all the renown. I'm going to have all the respect and admiration of all the people in this vast kingdom because I'm this close to the king and queen. I'm on top of the world. I can do this any way I want to do it. And that's what he sets about to do. So you look at verse 11 and 12. Verse 11 and 12, Haman told them, he called verse 10 for his friends and for Zeresh his wife, and Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children and all the things wherein the king had promoted him and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did not no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself. And tomorrow I'm invited unto her also with the king. So you look at your outline, he brags about his wealth. By the way, ladies in here, how many of you would put up with that more than 10 seconds if your husband pulled something like this? Honey, sit down. I want to tell you how wealthy I am. I want to tell you how powerful I am. I want to tell you how many children I have. Well, I would hope she would know that. I want to tell you how I've been promoted by the king, and I'm the only one that was invited to the banquet today, and I'm the only one that's invited tomorrow. And we would look at that, and we can almost picture Zeresh picking up a frying pan. Well, she doesn't pick up a frying pan, but later on we do see how she responds to it. And it's mockingly. This is how arrogant he is. Verse 13 says, yet all this availeth me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. This is the consequence of bitterness. Now granted, in his mind, hey, I've got it all. The only thing I don't have is the kingdom. And I really think somewhere along the line I'm going to get that too. But his bitterness and hatred of Mordecai is so strong that he says of himself, yet all this availeth me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gates. The consequence of bitterness. You look at the outline, with all that gives him pleasure, he's fixated on Mordecai. With all that he thinks he has achieved, Mordecai is that burr in the saddle that just won't go away. Somebody want to read Ephesians 4:31 and then somebody else Hebrews 12:15. How about Ephesians 4:31? Somebody got that? Want to read that for us? You all raise your hand at once. I can't tell who's first. So. Ephesians 4:31. Go ahead, Pastor.
And all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice.
Okay. What's the first thing in that list? Bitterness. Bitterness. Bitterness is a fixation and an obsession towards something or somebody that controls your mind and your life. And it will not let you rest. How about Hebrews 12:15? Mike, go ahead.
Looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled.
Okay? The root of bitterness springing up and bringing defilement in the process. As we see in point 3 here, bitterness will destroy. I heard somebody say one time they'd rather have cancer than be bitter. I'll stand here tonight and tell you that there have been 2 times in my life over the years where I battled bitterness. And it was somebody who had attacked God's work, they had attacked me, they had attacked my family. And I was bitter. Oh, I was functioning. I was going through the motions. But there was a bitterness that was there. That bitterness that had me thinking, you know, maybe I'll just drive to their house and ring the doorbell. And when they open it, I'm going to punch them right in the face. And watch them drop like a bag of wet cement. And then I'll feel better. Well, I wouldn't, because then I'd have had handcuffs behind my back and I'd have been on my way to jail. And I would have blamed them for it, which would have increased my bitterness. I'm not going to take too much longer on this, but I want to tell you how God took care of that. There was somebody that they kept popping up in my life. And every time I'd see them, it would just grate on me. And there were times when I would sit up at night and that's the only face I could see. I mean, I was bitter about what they had done. So the Christian school organization in Pennsylvania was having their fine arts competition, and the director of it called me and he said, how about coming and being a judge for the preaching competition? I said, sure, I'm happy to do it. Our kids were involved in it, and I said, yeah, I'll be there, that'll be fine. So I got there, and the way that the judging worked, there were two different banks of judges. And so bank one would listen to a guy preach or teach. It was also Bible teaching. Then they would take him aside and give him some tips, while bank two heard the next guy. And then bank one would come back in. And so I get there and I sit down, and I'm on a bank of judges, and I look down, 2 seats down from me, also on that bank of judges was that guy that I was so bitter toward. And I remember vividly saying, not audibly to anybody else, but, Lord, why him? Why have you done this? I've got to spend 6.5, 7 hours with this guy today. Lord, help me not to choke him in the process. And I was determined, because he had an arrogance about him, and I was determined that anything he said, I was going to tear it apart. And God began to work on my life all day long and work on my heart all day long. And I can tell you in all honesty, at the end of that day, the bitterness was gone. So in the morning I said, God, why have you done this? By late afternoon I could say, and I don't know that I did, but I could say, Lord, now I know why you did it. And there were factors involved. There were things that God used in the course of that day. It wasn't just sitting beside him, the bitterness went away. But those days when I carried that bitterness toward him, they were hard times in life. You're trying to go through the motions. You're trying to be a good parent and a good pastor and a good husband, and this is just seething there under the surface all the time. That's where Haman is. He hates Mordecai that much. And he says of himself in verse 13, as we read a moment ago, yet all this availeth me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. And then so go on to the last point here, verse 14. The callousness of Haman, his wife, and friends. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, just to go over it quickly. The gallows that we think of a gallows as a place where a man is hung. We've all seen pictures of that over the years, where there's a trap door and it's kicked out and somebody hangs to death. This gallows was not to kill somebody by hanging by their neck from a rope. It was a stake on which the person being executed was impaled. If you're not sure what that is, be happy you don't have a mental picture of it. They not only were impaled, but they were left there on display. And Haman's wife and his friends suggest that this thing be built. You can look here. Then said Zeresh's wife and all the friends unto him, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high. This would have been approximately 75 feet high in the town where everybody could see it. In fact, it likely would have towered above maybe everything but the palace. So that everybody could see Haman got his man. And that's what he's thinking. This is the callousness and the wickedness of heart of Haman, but not just Haman, but his wife and friends. They suggest the height of it so that this awful act can be carried out against Mordecai. With such a suggestion for the cruel killing of Mordecai, build it 75 feet high, take that guy and impale him on it, and let his body hang there or sit there with that impalement. Let him be on the top of that thing, and people can come by and mock him and watch the birds pick his flesh. And then they said, go in merrily with the king unto the banquet. Picture that. We're going to see this guy killed in a hideous way. Hey, have a good time at the lunch. That's the callousness. It is said that when Jimmy Hoffa was killed, some who claim to have been the ones who did it, still a question mark, But it's been said, and I won't go into the details, but after they killed him and did what they did with his body, they sat down and ate a spaghetti and meatball dinner and laughed and joked. That's the wickedness of the hearts. You know, when the Bible says that that our hearts are deceitful above all things, that they are wicked beyond measure, and it asks the question, who can know it? There are no depths to which the human heart can't sink. And we see that here. You look on, and it says that go in merrily with the king unto the banquet, and the thing pleased Haman. It pleased him. Delight at the thought of such a murder shows the wickedness and hardness of the hearts. He's delighting in this. I'll show that Mordecai. I'll give him a death that's going to be unparalleled in this land. I hate him, and this is what I'm going to do to him. I'm going to utterly destroy him. And now I'm going to go to the banquet and have fun. But listen, guys, while I'm gone, build the gallows. And that's what it says here. The thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. So the gallows have been built. And this then begins to play out the rest of it as God directs. And it's hard for us, again, sometimes to fathom that all this is unfolding and God knows about it. And we would look and say, why didn't God just stop it? Why would God let this go on? Because God had a plan to show his strength and his might and his protection for his people. And as he did so, it's there so that we will learn to trust him and have faith in him no matter what comes in life. None of us in here are in peril of being placed on such a gallows tomorrow. None of us in here are in peril of somebody seeking to take our life tonight. But that doesn't minimize the things in our lives that God wants to work through, to grow us and perfect us for his glory. Father, thank you for the time tonight. Thank you for your word. Thank you for this account that so vividly shows us not the gore, not the hatred, but your good hand. Bless us, we dismiss. Use us